Open Promises to Keep to page 8. A Black and White World. My great-grandparents were slaves. My grandmother was a sharecropper. My father was born into a segregated world. Although it may be hard for you to imagine an America where black and white people were kept apart by laws and customs, that world existed. My father helped change it. By breaking the color barrier in Major League Baseball, my father helped break down racial segregation. Before we get into the story of Jackie Robinson, however, we need to understand how segregation became a way of life in the United States. The story of race relations in the United States begins more than 400 years ago, when African men, women, and children were enslaved and forcibly brought to the American colonies. The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, ended this terrible, inhumane practice. By 1870, there were approximately 4 million African Americans in the United States who, because of the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, were now U.S. citizens. As freed men and women, some former slaves attended school for the first time, farmed in a system called sharecropping, voted, and held local, state, and federal offices. But the new freedoms granted to African Americans were unacceptable to many Southern whites who were used to being in control. These Southerners used political, legal, and violent means to control blacks. They passed state laws to restrict the rights of blacks and to keep them from voting. Even the courts denied blacks opportunities and basic human rights. In Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court held a state's right to pass racial segregation laws. The Supreme Court's ruling said that such laws did not violate the U.S. Constitution. The nation was divided, those favoring segregation against those who opposed it. The period of legal segregation in America is commonly referred to as the Jim Crow era. In the 1830s, Thomas Rice, a famous white music hall entertainer in Baltimore, Maryland, created a fictional character based on a black singer-dancer. Rice called his character Jim Crow. White audience laughed at the clowning and foolish antics of the character. Black people found the performances demeaning. They began to use the term Jim Crow to mean discrimination. Caption: This 19th century sheet music shows a Jim Crow figure. Notice that the song is sung by T. Thomas Rice in Ethiopian. Ethiopia is a country in Africa. Caption: Slave quarters, circa 1860 to 1863. Timeline: 1619. People kidnapped from Africa are brought to the Virginia colony. 1776. There are approximately 2 million slaves in the American colonies. After the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, approximately 55,000 free black people live in what is now the United States. 1787. The U.S. Constitution does not mention slavery, but it does ban the importation of slaves as of 1808. 1861 to 65. The Civil War rages between the Union, the North, and the Confederacy, the South. 1863. President Abraham Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees slaves in the Confederate States. 1865. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes slavery illegal everywhere in the United States. 1868. The 14th Amendment guarantees all people born in the United States, including African Americans, citizenship and protection under the law. Native Americans are not included. 1870. The 15th Amendment grants all male adult citizens the right to vote.